Fans Beyond Wrestling, this is Denver, Colorado, the man, not the place, being joined by Rich Palladino. This is going to be episode 3 of Positive Contact, of course, being brought to you by Independent Wrestling TV, a.k.a. IWTV.live. Sign up using promo code BEYOND for a free trial. There's been plenty of content added over the past couple weeks, but one of the first shows that was ever uploaded to the service from Beyond Wrestling was the initial American Rana, which is where Rich Palladino made his Beyond Wrestling debut. But Rich, obviously trying times right now. Let's get some plugs out of the way. What's the best way fans can support you right now?
I'm on Instagram, Ringside Rich. I'm on Twitter at Rich Palladino and Facebook as such as well. I appreciate that. I mean, I'd rather everybody support the guys that are making a living doing this, because obviously I make a living doing something else, and wrestling that's my side hustle. So, but I mean, I have new t-shirts. People have been asking for them. I have like 11 or 12 like Facebook and Twitter requests for sizes. I got 25 new shirts made, and they came in 2 days after my last show. So it looks like I'll be sitting on them for the rest of this damn pandemic. So.
No, we're going to be able to move some with the Positive Contact show. So, but you said ring announcing is your side hustle. You've been ring announcing for a pretty substantial period of time, going back to the 90s. How did you get involved in wrestling to begin with?
I mean, I was a fan ever since the first time I ever saw wrestling. I think I was maybe about 9 years old, watching old WWF TV in the late 70s. That's my passion. And as time went on, I just knew I was never going to become a pro wrestler. I never had the physical abilities to do such. I mean, the height of my athletic background was high school football, and I really wasn't even that good at that. So I just always figured announcing would be my thing. So I broke in through the Boston Bad Boy, Tony Rumble, in '93. Right place, right time. I mean, it'd be like a long shoot interview if I talked about how I actually broke in, but there was a guy that from New York that had run a show. Both of his parents had passed away. All right. So this is where it gets a little wonky. And he inherited a whole bunch of money. So he decided he was going to be a promoter, and he ran, yeah.
That doesn't happen too often in wrestling.
No. And then he had run a show actually at the Lowell Auditorium where like everybody, NXT and Ring of Honor and everybody run. It drew maybe 250 people, had every independent wrestling name on it. And it was going to be a big TV show. Anyways, I sat in the front row. I had bought a ticket, and I ended up meeting Tony Rumble later in life. And I ended up doing play-by-play with Tony in a TV studio in Maine for that show that I sat in the front row for. It never saw the light of day. But that was my first payday. And I just know that the guy that paid me, his name was Gordon Scazzari. He has since passed away. But the check that he paid me with said, from the inheritance of, and it was his parents. I was like, whoa, it's a weird way to break in. But but that was it.
Let me ask you this. I feel like a lot of times in wrestling, you're either a wrestler or you're everything else. So obviously we know that you've done ring announcing. That's kind of your primary gig within the realm of wrestling. We know that you also do commentary. What other roles have you taken on in your illustrious career?
Only announcing roles. I was very lucky. I didn't really have to do anything else. I started as a ring announcer in '90. I guess I started as a commentator. I don't really say that I started in '92 because the work that I did never went anywhere. But I've only been a ring announcer, an interviewer, and a commentator for 26 years. I've never had any other role. Now, I mean, when Championship Melt or Mama Colorado's Kitchen's representing, like at Evolve, if I'm not booked on the show, I'm happy to help out. I mean, I'll do whatever, like I always tell people when they want to break in, just offer to help with whatever you can. So, I mean, other than, helping out with whatever, or, driving boxes of merchandise from Worcester, Massachusetts to Jersey City, like I did a year ago for you, after a show, you know, whatever it takes. But no, I've always only been an announcer. So.
Did you ever get booked to be a manager on a show?
No, there were talks about it. I always had buddies that thought it would be fun if I did it, but I never wanted to kind of like branch out from what I do. Like, to me, it doesn't make sense if the ring announcer is also a manager or also a worker or whatever. That's just, I've always only wanted to be an announcer, and that's why I've always only done that. I've done a couple, very few parts of a show where I've been involved in a physical role, but only where it makes sense. Obviously, I did the thing with Larry at Battle of New England Returns, the boner. What year was that? 2014 when I wrestled.
That would have been 2015 because 2014 was the original Battle of New England.
Yeah, so this was the return, so now it was a boner. I'll never forget you calling me and you're like, hey, want to do a match with Larry? And I really didn't want to. But it made sense because we had like this natural heat. And I'll never forget, we were at Fett Music and me and Larry were going over a ton of different spots. And you were like over, like, I think where the food was or where the merch was. You're like, what are you guys doing? I'm like, oh, we're just going over stuff for our match. He's like, no, we're not doing all that. You're ring announcers. And obviously it was so much less than that. But I've done that. I've done things where I've tackled Bobby Cruz when, like, we've done like wars with Chaotic. He had filled in for me for a couple of shows, and then I ended up I was at XWA. I ended up tackling Bobby Cruz because they were like trying to take over. I just hate doing anything physical because I'm fat and out of shape, but I've never really aspired to do anything else, so announcing is just my thing.
Did you ever have a hand in anything maybe behind the scenes as far as like booking or pitching stories or? Okay.
Yeah, the early days of Chaotic, I actually did a little bit of booking behind the scenes, maybe for 3 or 4 months, when the guys that were running it were really not wrestling guys. And that's like another chapter in the book. This was like before Jamie was running Chaotic. There was a guy, Randy Miller, and we would sit here at my house, and you've been to Mikasa, and, you know, he'd bring, a case of beer and a couple bottles of wine, and we would be sitting around literally like having booking, brainstorming ideas, early days of Chaotic, like, but that was never really my thing. It was just more or less my way of saying, hey, let's get some, different wrestlers in here instead of just the same old. And here's a couple of ways we can utilize people a little bit better. But other than that, I did a couple of things here and there, helping out behind the scenes with like companies like Northeast Wrestling and Big Time Wrestling, just because I've been around long enough. So, I mean, whether it's little things like helping out with the State Athletic Commission for shows in New York, stuff like that, Northeast Wrestling has been very kind to me to, offer to have me help out backstage and compensate me for it. So, but that's few and far between. It's always me and a microphone. So.
Was there ever a time when you were helping out with booking, though, where you were able to go to bat for a certain talent to maybe that wasn't already with the promotion to bring them in? Was there anybody that you ever had kind of like, this person's performance will enhance what we're doing with this organization, making talent recommendations or anything like that?
Early days of Chaotic, yes. Because like I said, it really wasn't wrestling people that were running Chaotic at the very beginning. So I do take credit for bringing in a bunch of the Kowalski guys. And this is early 2000s. So this is, before most of our fan base, some of them may not have even been born. But in that vein, yes, I did bring in a good friend of mine, Mike Crockett, who was a great referee for years and years and years. He's on an extended hiatus right now because he's got a couple of kids. But he was a great referee, and we needed a referee. And I was, I brought him into Chaotic, and guys like Louis Ortiz and Slick Wagner Brown and Vince Vicalo and John Walters, these were all great students of Killer Kowalski's that I was able to bring into Chaotic just based on my recommendation and having seen them and worked with them. And I used to hang out at Kowalski School once or twice a week and just watch class because I love wrestling so much because I'm sick. So yeah. So I mean, I guess in that vein, yeah.
It's so funny to me because I feel like Chaotic in a lot of ways, it's difficult to separate the promotion from the school. And I mean, obviously, With it now being the New England Pro Wrestling Academy, I think in a lot of ways it's fair to say that it's still kind of the spiritual successor of Killer Kowalski's wrestling school. But prior to it being the New England Wrestling Academy, it was the Chaotic Training Center.
CTC, the Chaotic Training Center, and then when Kowalski's lease was up at his building in Malden, he and Mike Hollow, who was his head trainer, had come over to the Chaotic School, and it became the Chaotic Training Center, home of Killer Kowalski's Institute of Professional Wrestling. And Walter was much older then, so he was a little less hands-on. He would come in and show you how to do everything right, or the way he wanted it done. But yeah, that was the early days in North Andover. I mean, when I was bringing in the Kowalski guys, we were just starting with the school. This was more or less, hey, how can we make these shows a little bit better? And that's kind of where I got involved.
So when the Chaotic Wrestling organization started, it didn't have an affiliation with the school. And then, but Killer Kowalski School, how long did that go back?
Kowalski School itself?
Yeah.
Mid-70s.
Wow. And it was always up in Malden?
Yeah. Malden, Massachusetts. The building's no longer there. I think it's all condominiums or something now. At this day and age, it's probably absolutely nothing, not being used whatsoever because of the pandemic. But yeah, no, Walter's school had been there since the 70s, I dare say.
Do you have any recollection of how they would both advertise that there was a school? Because that's kind of a modern concept within the world of professional wrestling, but also protect the business at the same time?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was such a different world back then, too. I just remember hearing about it. I lived in Reading, Massachusetts, which was maybe 20 minutes away. When I broke into the business in 93, I had friends that trained there. And once Walter took a liking to me, I was able to just sit in and watch. But as far as how people knew, that's a really good question because we didn't have social media like we do now, or, there might have been some cable advertisements or something, but I think it was just more or less, hey, this is a legend. This is Killer Kowalski. And I think those within the know knew that he had a school. And that was like the school. It's not like, there's so many different schools now. There's so many different places to go. It's just, when you got a guy like Killer Kowalski, it's a no-brainer that's the place where you want to train. And that was the place like I said, probably early to mid 70s and into the 80s. And, you could go through the whole list of people that came up through there. But yeah, that was the place to train.
So when you started announcing shows, it was with Tony Rumble's events?
Yes.
And
Century.
I'm sorry.
It was the Century Wrestling Alliance before buying into the NWA. So it was Century Wrestling Alliance, and then it became NWA New England up until he passed in 99.
Did Tony have any affiliation with Kowalski?
Later on, it did. At first, there weren't as many promotions as there are now. And I'll put promotions in quotations because, there's professional wrestling and then there's semi-pro wrestling. And there really wasn't that much back then. And Tony did a lot of sold shows back in the day, meaning fundraisers for schools and whatnot, where my first show that I did in October of 93 at Wakefield High School was in front of like 1,800 people. And yeah, I'm talking Wakefield High School gym. I've got pictures. I have a VHS of it somewhere. Main event was the Iron Sheik defending the Century Wrestling Alliance title, even though there really was no title nor a belt, against Vic Steamboat, who was Ricky Steamboat's little brother, legit, who lived in Dracut. And then we had Tony Atlas against Tommy Dreamer, and I'm talking babyface Tommy Dreamer with, shiny blue pants and suspenders. We had 1,500 people. It was like a fundraiser for like the Wakefield Boosters Club or something, but it was like 1,500 or 1,800 people at the high school gym. It was pretty crazy. But the point being that Kowalski also had a telemarketer that gave him sold shows. So at first there wasn't like a real love relationship between the two. But as time went on, we ended up working with Walter and bring in a lot of his students onto Tony's shows, which made the product even better. And we would do many different cities and towns and multiple states. So we could set up the same angle, and every show would be Tony Rumble and his heel faction, the Brotherhood, getting into it with Killer Kowalski and Mike Hollow and all of his students. And every show would end with Kowalski putting Tony in the stomach claw. So that's my story of the 90s.
Talk to me a little bit about how one of those independent shows would be formatted, because since I've been involved in wrestling, we've gone from kind of like the 8-match card, 3 hours of footage essentially, and I think that kind of favored putting as much content as possible on a DVD or even a VHS, to kind of seeing where it got to the point where talent development was such a focus that, I mean, sometimes our Beyond Wrestling shows, oh my God. And back in the day at FET, sometimes we would run 5+ hours in some instances.
Yeah,
Not ideal and not always necessarily by design. To now where we're kind of introducing uncharted territory and being able to go back to a shorter format, which fans are still accepting, because in a lot of ways, less can be more when you're prioritizing quality over quantity. But now, just in general, independent wrestling is so much more experimental. What were the shows back in when you started getting involved in the independent wrestling scene, though? What were they formatted? Like, how many matches on a card? How long would the matches go? Would there be, a run sheet in the back saying these are specifically all of the times? How long would the event itself go? Would there be intermissions? Like, talk me through, like, an average, or was there not an average?
So, I mean, I can speak. I mean, I worked for Tony from 93 until he passed in 99. I really didn't work for many other promotions. Couple of indies every now and again that would want to pay me a lot of money because I was doing ECW too on the side, which was nice. But as far as Tony's shows, they were 6 to 7 match cards, typically. And it was a lot of just local, I don't want to say undercard guys, but a lot of local guys would be like, say, matches 1 through 6. And then your main event would be like Tony Atlas or King Kong Bundy or Hacksaw Jim Duggan. If the budget was there, it'd be against maybe 2 of those names against each other. And if not, it was one of those names against like the top guy in the area. That's the way shows worked back then. It was, big name superstar at the top, everybody else underneath. You put that main event on last, featuring that TV superstar, so everybody had to watch all the local talent. And then as Tony's promotion grew, we did more shows without stars, but people were so acclimated. They knew who Knuckles Nelson and Eric Sprazier and Trey the Smooth Operator were, and Kid USA Jay Gillette, whose son is now wrestling, which blows my mind. That we ended up running our own shows, because the goal back then, which is so much different than today, is I see the YouTube awards over your shoulders there. Back then it was about getting on not public access, but actual cable television, local, the local, whatever the station you'd have in Rhode Island or whatever I had in Massachusetts or whatever's in New Hampshire. Then those shows would just feature all the local talent, and we'd have a 30 or 60-minute show on WNDS up in New Hampshire that would air like on Saturday nights at 11 o'clock. And those would be like marathon TV tapings that we would do for little money, because the trade-off was, I'm not paying you a lot of money, but I'm giving you a lot of exposure. But as far as run sheets, honest to God, it was Tony. The way Tony did it was he would just put his lineup on a piece of paper. Matches 1 through 7, break the intermission. It was usually 4 up, 3 down, 4 matches, intermission, 3 matches. Just the 2 names as they were to come to the ring in that order. And, whoever was up, just be underlined or circled. It was a very simple method. And like I said, we didn't have all the tools that we have now when putting together a show.
Was there ever instances of wrestlers like being greedy and like, this guy was, it was assumed that you should wrestle 10 to 15 minutes, but for some reason these guys wrestled 35 minutes this one night? Or was it not like that? Was there not, if something like that happened, would there be repercussions?
Back then everybody pretty much stuck to their times. Tony was a pretty stern guy. He was, for a guy that I considered a dear friend for the 6 years I worked for him, he was a very intimidating. individual. He was about 6'4", 260 pounds, and no nonsense. And everybody knew that was the place to work. So everybody pretty much stuck to their times. I don't really remember anybody going over, but on the flip side, Kowalski shows, he'd want you to do, I'm bouncing all over the place, but Tony's matches be 8 to 10, 12 to 15 minutes, whatever. We didn't have 20, 30-minute marathon matches where Kowalski would run, say, 6 matches, and they'd be like 20 to 30 minutes in length, in all honesty, because Walter was old school, and that's how you worked in the old school. So I don't know if that answers the question per se, because I really wasn't involved as much behind the scenes back then. I was strictly just the ring announcer. But Tony would call me and want to bounce ideas off me and stuff like that. He respected my opinion, and because I was always so eager to want to do more. I used to make programs. I used to make. I swear to God, I have one in a drawer if I reach over here. Because I just found this the other day. But I used to make programs like on like a shitty little like computer. Like this was a Century Wrestling Alliance show, and we were doing a night where we were honoring Killer Kowalski. And this was my high tech thing with, an autograph page on the back. And if there were local ads, like if we had sponsors, we would just throw their flyer right in there. So this was World Gym Somerville, because we were running in Somerville at the former Good Time Emporium, which I'm sure you heard about. That was like a real hotbed. I made up bullshit ratings. So it was such a different time back then. It was so much simpler back then. But like I said, the goal was just to get on actual TV.
When the show got to TV, was it a situation where you had to pay to be on TV and it would be offset by then getting sponsors, or would TV be paying fees to be on local television?
You'd be paying for the TV time. I can't speak for Tony. I know that when Chaotic first started, we were paying for that time slot. Jamie's head nearly exploded. Somebody said that we lost close to $1 million in our first year of operation because we were paying so much to be on WUNI TV 27 out of beautiful Worcester, which was the Univision affiliate back then. Probably still is. But yeah, no, you would pay for the TV time. So I can't speak for Tony. I really wasn't involved as much with the TV deals, but we were like the only company that was really on something that wasn't public access or recorded in somebody's backyard. It was like legitimate professional wrestling in a professional wrestling ring on a station that wasn't, Taunton Cable or Woburn Cable. It was like the real thing. So it was pretty cool.
Now, it sounds like with some of the sample cards that you were talking about, like somebody like King Kong Bundy, Hacksaw Jim Duggan, Ricky Steamboat's brother, these are wrestlers that are local to the area that are probably driving in. Were there ever any chance, was there ever a situation where like a name wrestler would get flown in, or was that kind of unheard of back then?
No, that was actually my second show had the Bushwhackers on it, and they were certainly not local. Tony Atlas lived and still does live in Maine, so he was like everybody's top draw. When Brutus Beefcake, whenever he was not on a national stage somewhere, he lived in Winchester, so he was another local draw. Duggan would drive in from New York. Bundy would drive in from New Jersey. So yeah, a lot of them were drive-ins, but depending on the budget and depending on the fundraiser would depend on the talent. Because we had other shows. We had, Tony was really good friends with Kevin Sullivan. Kevin Sullivan was like booking our shows and actually booking talent to be extras or enhancement talent on Nitro, believe it or not, WCW Saturday Night way back in the 90s. At one point when Jim Cornette was working for the WWE and living in Connecticut, he was booking shows for Tony Rumble. So, think about that. 2 different eras. We had Kevin Sullivan as a booker, and we had Jim Cornette as a booker. Kind of mind-boggling when you think about it. And I know Cornette's not the most popular guy these days. But, he would literally drive in from Connecticut and book the shows. And Kevin was obviously a fly-in, but he and Tony were good friends from way back in the ICW Savoldi days. I'm probably talking, and people are probably like, "What the hell is he even talking about?" Because
Hey, you know what? Depending on how long this pandemic lasts, maybe we'll have a time to delve even further into the past, but hopefully not. Um, so let's say you're an aspiring wrestler coming up on the independent scene, kind of in the early '90s. The goal is to get to television because if you can get to, being on the New Hampshire television, is it a situation where then you can submit tapes to WWF and WCW? What is your path as a wrestler at that point, or was it a lot of weekend warrior types?
a lot of weekend warrior types. There weren't Wednesday night shows and Thursday night shows. Um, I will say what Tony Rumble did was February and April school vacation weeks. We would run triple shots, triple headers, 3 shows in one day in one venue to tape all that stuff for TV. So then it was always at Good Times in Somerville. And we would do one show at 11 in the morning. We would do one show at 4 in the afternoon and one at 7 p.m. just because all the kids would be home from school on school vacation. But yeah, the goal was that was the place to work. If you weren't working for Kowalski, you wanted to work for Tony. And the only other like full-time promotion that was around back then, that's still around, Top Rope Promotions, which was called Yankee Pro way back then. So those were like the only places to work. Tony was the only guy that had TV, but you also wanted to be seen in front of Kevin Sullivan, and you wanted to be seen in front of Jim Cornette. And a lot of guys got opportunities. Big Rick Fuller, who's still a good friend of mine to this day, worked for years for WCW. More in an enhancement role, or mid-card, but because Kevin Sullivan was impressed with him. Ace Darling and Devin Storm, a.k.a. Crowbar, they were a big tag team on the indie scene, and they ended up doing stuff in WCW because of working for Tony so much. So the goal was, you work for Kowalski, you're going to have really closer ties to WWE because he's Killer Kowalski. And most of Kowalski's guys would be enhancement talent on WWE programming. I'm talking Superstars and Challenge, all the stuff that's out there right now on the network. Tony's guys were getting opportunities in WCW and hoping to get TV opportunities with WWE as well when Cornette was running things. So that was the goal. Everybody was a weekend warrior, just hoping that the right person would see it, or Kowalski and himself would see something in you and give you that opportunity to get somewhere else and do bigger things.
Sure, because I feel like when I started getting involved in the indies 10 years ago, it was just kind of like the indies are it. You'd have to be somebody exceptional. And then even when you'd have somebody like Paul London, it's like, well, Paul London got signed. He's on the smaller side, but he trained with Shawn Michaels, so it's not a big surprise. And then it's like somebody like CM Punk gets signed. It's like, well, he's not what they're looking for, but at least he can talk. So you can kind of justify it. And then it got to the point where it's like, well, wait a minute. There's no mold anymore. Like, they're taking anybody. So I wasn't necessarily sure there was kind of a different path, but we've been talking about WCW. We've been talking about WWF. Palladino, you did ring announcing for ECW.
I did. Yeah, that was honestly, like, if my career ended tomorrow, I've probably got about 5 things that I consider highlights. That's probably top of the list because that kind of gave me a little bit of name value around here. But I was a huge ECW mark as it was. Loved the product. Anyways, and I started with them in late '96 and worked for them until early '99.
Now, is that a situation where they're reaching out to you, you're reaching out to them, somebody's going to bat on your behalf? How do you get a foot in the door with ECW?
I had a lot of people that went to bat for me. Truth be told, then the first time that I worked for ECW, even to this day, I usually don't go to another show without having my tux in the car because I own it. And that weekend, I had my tux with me, and ECW ran in Revere at Wonderland Greyhound Park, which is also no longer there. They had been using Mel Simons, he was Killer Kowalski's ring announcer. Older gentleman, had been doing Kowalski's shows probably since the 70s. ECW used him for their first couple of shows. When I got to Wonderland in November of '96, Paul Richard, longtime WWF referee, ECW referee, local promoter for ECW, he had a comp ticket for me. And when I got there, he was like, "Do you have your tuxedo?" And I said, "Of course." And he goes, "Okay, they want to use you. I put in a good word for you. You're ring announcing tonight. So after I shit myself, it was surreal. I couldn't believe it was actually happening. And I got to work for them for 2.5 years, but I also had Paul Richard vouching for me, but I also had Dreamer and Taz, who was also on that first show I did for Tony Rumble in '93, that knew me and vouched for me. So those were three pretty good names to have that knew me. So yeah, I did that for over 2 years, about 2.5 years. It was pretty awesome.
Who makes the final call day of? Is that a Heyman decision?
As far as me announcing?
Yes.
Yeah, I guess Paul Richard had pitched it to Heyman, and it'll sound kind of tacky because I'm talking to you right now, but it was kind of like the first time I worked for you, like the first time I worked for ECW. You know, Heyman called me over to pay me, and he goes, "I want you on every show I do in New England." And I remember, I dare say it, Fet Music over by the stairs before I left that night. You paid me and said, "I want you on every show." And
well,
you're like the Paul.
Of course, this broadcast being brought to us by Independent Wrestling TV, and I just saw earlier today IWTV.live streaming the We Care a Lot program.
Yes.
And we had one Joey Eastman, now known as Sidney Bacabella, doing the ring announcing, and
yes,
he did his best, but it's no Rich Palladino ring announcing, so I think things have a way of kind of working themselves out. I feel like I would be remiss. I'm sure you're probably sick of telling the story, but for people that maybe are listening to this interview with you for the first time, part of being at ECW in Massachusetts means being there for the mass transit incident.
My first show.
That was the first show.
That was the November 23rd of '96. That was my very first. That was the show where Paul Richard said, "Hey, brother, do you have your tuxedo?" That was the mass transit incident. So, oh my God, I'm waiting. I'm waiting for the. I know Vice is going to do a series on an episode on New Jack, and they're going to talk about that. Actually, they're going to talk about the mass transit incident and everything else that New Jack did. Yeah, that was my first show. I went from going in the locker room for the first time, and the first three people I saw were Francine, Beulah, and Tammy Sitch. We're all three there. I'm like, oh my God, I've died and gone to wrestling heaven. To my first assignment was welcoming everybody to the show, being cut off by Taz's music, and Taz was super heel at the time. And he came out and intimidated me, and I crawled out of the ring and kind of kneeled on the table, and the table broke. That's a shoot. To the Gangsters match and everything that came with it. And, God love Joel Gertner, because Gertner had done ring announcing for ECW, but at this point he was like the heel mouthpiece for the Dudleys. So he was, and I knew Gertner from just being around the indies for the few years that I had been in it. And he coached me through everything. He said, when the Gangsters come to the ring, just get out. Like we do the way I introduce the matches and beyond, the boxing style. Excuse me. We did the same thing in ECW. He said, but when the Gangsters come out and you see them throw the trash can, just get out. It was okay, fine. So the mass transit, the match was supposed to be the Gangsters against Devon Dudley and Axel Rotten, who were a tag team at the time. And Axel had a family emergency that weekend. I believe his grandmother was very sick at the time, and he couldn't make the New England loop. So Eric Koulas, who was referred to as Mass Transit, filled in, had told everybody in the back that he had actually come to the show, I want to say with Tiny the Terrible and his brother Half Nelson, who they had done comedy matches with. Eric was a big 400-pound kid, and he would wrestle the two midgets in comedy style matches. So somehow they tried to pitch that to Heyman. Heyman didn't want it, but needed a body to fill in for Axel, who wasn't there, and that was willing to get beat up by the Gangsters. And that's how it came to be. And he told everybody that he was 19, that he was trained by Kowalski, both which were not true. And he worked himself into the match, but the story is, and I guess I should wait for the show on Vice to come out, but I mean, there's plenty of interviews out there, but story is that he was in the back smoking a cigarette, very nonchalant, pretty much telling the gangsters the spots he wanted to get in because his father and his brother were out there. And New Jack asked him if he'd ever bladed before, and he said he hadn't, and asked New Jack to blade for him, and the rest is history. But that was my first ECW show, and I was terrified. I was scared.
I'd never seen ringside throughout all of it, right? You were there.
Yeah. So I was like, the table was right up against the ring, and I was there. And when I saw as badly as he was bleeding, I actually ran to the back, and I found Paul Richard and Heyman were talking, and I was like, I think there's a potential problem because the local kid's bleeding a lot out there. So he said, all right, go back. And, I said, I think we're going to need some towels. I wasn't as calm as I am right now. I was like, we need towels. And they told me to go back out. And at that point, New Jack had already finished everything and was looking for the house mic, which was in my hand. So I got there just in the nick of time to hand it back to him to cut his promo. But yeah, that was like surreal. And to think that's such a big part of wrestling history now. It caused ECW's first pay-per-view to be altered and have a later start time and all this other stuff. And then, you fast forward to 6 months ago, and I got to ring announce a show for Big Time Wrestling, and New Jack wrestled Chris Dickinson. So, I mean, it's just kind of funny how things come full circle. But, I mean, there's all different versions of the story. I only know what I saw. I just know that where I was standing at the bell, if you see the footage and you hear the kid's father's screaming, ring the effing bell, he's 17, he's talking to me. And it was my first night, so I wasn't doing anything unless Paul Heyman told me to do it. So it was pretty effed up. But
how were Tiny the Terrible and Half Nelson connected with ECW? Because I mean, obviously, for you to even just be able to get on as a ring announcer, obviously there was a vetting process with Dreamer and Taz and Paul Richards going to bat for you. What clout did they have to even get mass transit backstage that Heyman would see him and say, yeah, we need a body, this guy will do?
Honestly, I don't know. I wish I knew the answer to that. I don't know if it was, because they knew Paul Richard and Mike Bonansky, who was the other local promoter. I don't know if maybe they were going to bat, like, hey, we're hardcore wrestling. Wouldn't it be funny if, these two little guys beat up this big fat guy? I mean, I honestly don't know what kind of clout. And I will say this, though. The one thing that really stands out for that night is most ECW shows, Kowalski was there. And this was the one night that he wasn't there. And if he had been there, obviously, history wouldn't have gone down the way it did. I want to say they were in Webster, Mass. the night before. And they actually were in Webster the night before because I was there. And Joey Styles was kind of doing the ring announcing. It was more or less a TV production that they were doing that night. And Kowalski was there that night, I remember. And it was just the next night in Revere, and he wasn't there. And everything would have just been so different if he had been there. So.
What do Kowalski and Tony Rumble say about kind of the violent style of ECW coming into their neck of the woods? Was there ever a concern where it's like, they're going to kill the territory, or they're going to cost us buildings, or was it just like ECW is its own thing, let them do it? Or
I think Kowalski, and I didn't work for Walter directly, so I can't speak for his views, but, he had the Eliminators were such a big part of ECW, and he had trained them. So I don't think he really worried about it as much as, hey, here's two guys that I trained very well, and now they're on a bigger stage. Tony, I will say that weekend, because of our affiliation in the Century Wrestling Alliance with Kevin Sullivan, Tony was actually in Roanoke, Virginia that weekend for WCW's World War III pay-per-view. Remember the 3-ring battle royals, 60 guys? Tony was one of those 60 guys in 1996. So Tony wasn't even around, and Tony knew Heyman, from the Indies, and probably when ECW was Eastern Championship Wrestling. So he knew Heyman. And Tony lived in Revere too, and he was gone, like I said, that weekend for the WCW pay-per-view. But to answer your question about how Tony felt about it, I got an earful Monday morning. He called me livid because there was so much news about the bloodletting that happened at Wonderland, and that his ring announcer was on the show. And he, like I said, he was an intimidating guy. He scared the crap out of me because he was like, "You're going to have to go to court and testify. And, you are a witness now and blah, blah, blah," which I never had to. But he was pissed about it. I think just because of all the backlash, because we ran in surrounding towns too. So think about it now. We can't do anything today. I mean, forget about the pandemic. You can't say anything. You can't do anything. You can't reference anything without offending somebody. Here was a bloodletting in one of the towns that he ran in. So I knew he wasn't too happy about it.
Did there end up being a blowback though from local communities?
Not so much as far as shutting wrestling down. I know New Jack was not on another ECW show in Massachusetts for close to a year because everything went to court. No, there really wasn't a backlash, because when I say it, it made a lot of news and it made the rounds and stuff. I'm talking TV news, maybe local newspaper publications like the Boston Phoenix, which I don't even think exists anymore. But that's how the word was getting out back then. And it did make the local news, but it really didn't impact like, oh no, we're not going to do pro wrestling because, we heard some 17-year-old kid got his forehead cut open in Wonderland. I think in today's day and age with social media, yeah, it probably would have had a bigger backlash, but it really didn't back then. And it didn't really affect, Tony's, it absolutely didn't affect Tony's draw or anything like that. It was an isolated incident. It was a weird situation. I think it had more of an impact on ECW than anybody, because obviously they had to alter cards. And like I said, it did.
Sure, but the next time the ECW came to Massachusetts, how did it affect their draw?
Their draw was fine because people were expecting to see something like that again.
Yeah.
I think people were waiting for it, because whereas now, like, think about like our good friend Jay Freddy when he fell off the top rope in Worcester, and everybody was like, "Oh my God," and we're all like super concerned. Like, this kid was bleeding all over the place and getting stretchered out, and the fans wanted more. Like they were like, New Jack was just butchering this kid, and the fans were cheering for more and standing up, and they were rabid, like insane. Whereas now it's like, yeah, you're compassionate about, the ones that you come to see. And I never want to put Jay Freddy in the same same echelon as the mass transit incident. But it was just, it didn't affect. They were always sold out. And I'll never forget the first time New Jack came back after the court thing and he was acquitted and everything. I'll never forget, we were in Waltham, completely sold out at the old IBW hall, and building was, the line was going around the building, and he just came in the locker room and goes, "You're welcome for the house, boys." Just because that was a different crowd. I mean, the performers in ECW always said the crowd made the show, and look at today. Now, you never realize it as much as you do right now, how important that crowd is to the product. And it was just crazy. But yeah, no, ECW did fine.
Yeah, I'm sure. I was gonna say they probably were doing better than ever, because just the word getting out there, where it's kind of like not having social media, not being able to see the clips, where it's kind of like, man, like I need to see this with my own eyes. But you brought up Jay Freddy. Let's delve into Beyond Wrestling. How did you first hear about Beyond Wrestling? What was your initial thought? Because I think we were doing tapings at Fury's New England Pro Wrestling Academy before we started doing live events in the area.
Yeah, at first I was like, what the hell's Beyond Wrestling, and why is it running at Fury's school? And, well, I should say my ego first said, wait a minute, how come I wasn't booked as a ring announcer for a show at Fury's school? Because I didn't know of Beyond Wrestling when you were running at the garage in Ohio. We started in 09, 08, 09?
2009, May 2009.
Okay. Yeah, so how I found out about Beyond Wrestling was, first I heard about the studio tapings. Then I remember hearing what they were. And, oh, okay, this is for YouTube. And, oh, there's not a formal ring announcer. I think Shug D was doing the ring announcing at some point, maybe.
He liked to jump in,
Yeah. So I get it that it wasn't like a formal, like, okay, put on a tuxedo and announce matches in front of no fans. But the way so I was just kind of keeping up with that, like what was going on at the school. But once the first American Rana in July of 2013 was at Fet Music, I saw all the posters and, the advertisements and everything for it. And again, I hadn't been booked. I hadn't heard anything. And I was just like, oh, my favorite wrestler's on there, Colt Cabana. I'm a huge Colt Cabana fan. And I'm also a big Biff Busick fan. And I've been a good friend of Biff's for years. And I called Biff and I go, what is this Beyond show at Fetty Music? I didn't know what the hell Fet was. I didn't know how to pronounce it, obviously. And he goes, oh, it's like our first, it's going to be like a big show. Let me talk to Drew. And he did. And he called me back. You're not going to like me saying this, but he goes, all right, look, he doesn't have a budget for a ring announcer. He can give you this if you want to do it. And I said, yeah, I'm going to do it. And I'll tell you straight up, there was so much talent there that I only heard of or seen like on YouTube or on video, and I had never worked with before. So that day was super nerve-wracking because there were so many guys that I had not actually announced. Tabernacle Day Team, EYFBO, Team Tremendous. I knew Dan Barry just from the indie scene, but I'd never known Team Tremendous and everybody else on that first show. So I was nervous as hell. But I will say, and I've said this publicly, and it's no offense to anybody else, it's just working for Beyond kind of like rejuvenated my career or what's left of it because, I'm old. But after that first show, I couldn't wait to do the next one. And that's a God honest truth. And I was actually just interacting with one of the fans on Twitter that had checked out American Rana 13 and said, what should I watch next? And I went to cagematch.net to see what the next show was after that. Was it critically acclaimed?
It's a Point of No Return.
Point of No Return, close enough. And I remember just going like, well, this is the next one. I said, if we're going to be all locked up in our houses, start binge watching 6.5 years of Beyond Wrestling. You'll be glad you did. So that's how I heard about it. I just heard about it on social media, called Biff. Biff called you. I passed the audition, and now you can't get rid of me until I retire or die. So
hopefully it'll be the first, not the second. We'll have Dave Cole do a painting for you. I think Dave Cole is going to be one of the guests coming up on Positive Contact. Again, of course, we're talking about the first American Rana. It's available on Independent Wrestling TV. So we definitely want to encourage everybody, sign up for IWTV.live. Using promo code Beyond will get you a free trial, and then you can start with 6 years of Beyond content, watching the first American Rana. Had Colt Cabana never competed no, he must have for Chikara, right? But
he did when he was actually NWA champion. I think he and Adam Pearce had a best of 7 series.
Oh yeah, because they did one of the matches at the Bridgewater building that we did a couple shows at.
Yeah, I think might have been for New England Championship Wrestling, Sheldon Goldberg's promotion. I believe he had one of those matches, but I had only worked with Colt once before. I got to do one Ring of Honor show in 2010. It was the 8th anniversary extravaganza because Bobby Cruz had the show was booked after he made vacation plans, and Bobby vouched for me, and I did that show in New York City, which was the night that Tyler Black won the title from Austin Aries. That was the first time I had met Colt, and for every time that I saw Colt after that, I was always Bobby Cruz's ring announcing buddy. So that's how Cabana, and now, Colt's, one of those guys that I can call or text, and he's a really good dude. He's always been very good to me. Hell, he had me on the Art of Wrestling. The Art of Wrestling podcast one time, but that was it. I saw, and you had Kevin Steen and Masada and all these other guys, and I'm like, oh my God, I got to be on this show. So that's why I took the little payday. And
we're talking about some bigger names right now. Longtime fan Zach Souza wants to know: has there ever been anybody that you felt surreal sharing a ring with, announcing them in Beyond Wrestling specifically?
Wow. My God. Nick Gage, the very first time I announced Nick Gage, only because I had never worked with him live, and he's another intimidating guy. That was kind of surreal to me. Actually announcing Steen the first time was another thing. And I think you had said it too, like you were a little nervous around him or intimidated by him?
Yeah, you know, it was the first American Rana doing the locker room meeting in front of everybody. And again, going back to, I just saw We Care a Lot earlier today, and it was just like incident after incident after incident after incident that even though we'd already announced American Rana, I almost didn't even want to go forward with it. We did, but I just remember it's like I have to take the reins on the show. I have to give a big locker room meeting. And then I just remember standing on the stage at FET and looking at everybody standing on the floor. And then I'm looking and like Kevin Steen's looking at me like, it's just like, why am I in charge of this guy? Like, this guy should be in charge of me. You know what I mean? Like, what experience do I have that he's going to listen to me? But,
Yeah.
you know, talking about different paydays and stuff like that. I mean, the first American Rana, we did not have much money to work with. A couple of my buddies kind of pitched in because they specifically wanted to, like, one of my buddies, I think, got a flight. Another one, I think, might have helped out with Masato's booking fee because they really wanted to see him versus Kevin Steen. And it's funny how, you know, sometimes people will come in for an opportunity. In your instance, you know, coming in lower than what we normally ask as a one-time thing to show your worth, then being able to come on full price. Steen actually did the opposite. He said, you know, I really like Beyond Wrestling. You took care of Tabernacle Team. If you can get us on more shows, I'll actually come down on my price, which is something that I always really appreciated.
Yeah.
I was definitely intimidated around him. And I mean, you know, you think some of the bigger names that we've had too, like Samoa Joe versus Chris Dickinson, that's always one that sticks out to me. Even having John Morrison at American Rana last year, which, you know, unfortunately, because of how incompetent the setup was at Foxwoods, you know, a lot of people weren't necessarily there for that influx. But kind of looking back on it, I mean, between him and the Rock and Roll Express, it's like two different, you know, ends of the spectrum as far as having, you know, legendary wrestling personalities on the same show. But, you know, again, you said being intimidated by Nick Gage the first time announcing him. I don't think that the fans know the extent to which you prepare. Like, you were constantly getting with the wrestlers before the show. If you've never even, I mean, not just at the show itself, you'll even, if it's people you haven't worked with prior, send messages to make sure that everybody is being announced that the way that they want to, that all of the information is accurate. Go into that process, because I don't feel like we see that with a lot of the other ring announcers. I don't know. It's not a matter of not taking it seriously, but it's just, you know, you definitely do it at a higher level than most.
Oh, thank you. And just to answer Zach's question, I would have to say the most surreal moment, now that you hit on American Rana 19, as an old school wrestling fan, when I got to announce the Rock and Roll Express, that was just ridiculous. I mean, granted, Janela spoiled it because I got to do his spring break show, so I did get to announce them against EYFBO. But to be able to announce them again against Butcher and the Blade at American Rana, that was mind-blowing to me. And another thing, I know I'm getting up there in age. I can't remember, you brought in so many, like, top names over my past almost 7 years working for you. It's just like, I can't even remember half of them. It's like, I watch stuff on IWTV, and I'm like, oh my God, I forgot we had this match. So, but back to, the preparations. And I'll tell every wrestler I talk to, I usually apologize first, say I'm sorry, I just take my job way too seriously. But to me, I should not be looking at a piece of paper or an index card. So I want to try and memorize it best I can. So I have a roster. It's probably about 18 or 20 pages, alphabetical. It's probably 60 names per page. Pretty much every wrestler that I've ever announced for the past 10 or 12 years anyways. I wish I started it sooner. So if you have two guys on a match, I've already announced them before. I already write up my card here. So when I get to the building, and then I usually ask them, oh, Josh Briggs, are you still using Nothing, Arizona as your hometown? And 269 pounds? Okay. And Bitch Destroyer? Okay, fine. And I always, to me, it's a privilege to be able to announce these athletes. So they should have a proper introduction. And I always want, and this is more the way my mind works, but I want them to know that they're such an important part of the show that I'm going to give them the best intro I can without having to look it up. Now, I do have to look it up if it's somebody for the first time and I don't get to connect with them online before the show. And I do have to kind of look at my card, which I hate doing, but that's just me. And I have a ridiculous amount of respect for this business. And I have even more respect for everybody that competes in the ring. So, that's just it. It's like clockwork to me. Like right now, I don't know what to do with myself because I don't have any shows, but that's just it. I prepare. I have to have, it's always good because especially with uncharted territory, at least I knew when we'd wrap up on one Thursday, I knew what we were doing the next Thursday. And I usually start working on my cards the next morning just because, and I rehearse and sometimes I give the cards to my kids and be like, all right, I'm going to give you the stats. Tell me if I got it right because I just want to get it right. So I'm a perfectionist when it comes to that. Everything else in my life, I could give a shit. But
well, I mean, one of the things that was so nice about uncharted territory, one of the things I was afraid of is like, oh, if we do it so much, it's going to become routine. And what I think that I failed to realize is that, like, just because something's routine doesn't necessarily mean that it's not special. What it meant was that when it was routine, there was a lot of guesswork that was taken out of the day-to-day. It got to the point where it was kind of habitual, where some of the more mundane components of running the show almost, I don't want to say ran themselves, but it wasn't like, oh no, how do we get the ring in the building every time, which can be an issue.
Sure.
So, it's cool that we're able to do, live interviews like this in order to be able to kind of to fill the time and, help educate the fans and, help really connect really integral parts of Beyond Wrestling with the fans in a way different than putting on a live wrestling show. Obviously, I wish that we were back to doing shows, and who knows what the future is going to be looking like going forward. But one of the things that has kind of infiltrated the wrestling scene, large in part to this guy. I can't see the full shirt, but it says independent David Starr. Is he kind of brought back, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I remember Steve Carino being the first wrestler going overboard with the long introductions.
Yeah.
And then David Starr kind of bringing that back. But then you see a lot of copycats. Does that get frustrating to you when it frustrates me? To me, it takes up unnecessary time on the show when, 6 of the wrestlers on the card have a whole string of nicknames. And it's just like, all right, we came for the wrestling. What are your thoughts on that?
So he definitely brought it back. That's how Bobby Cruz started with Ring of Honor, was as Steve Carino's personal ring announcer. And I think Carino's gimmick was basically having Bobby run off every single like wrestling championship that he had held, like probably since his debut, however long ago. The David Starr thing kind of took a mind on its own. I will say right here, and I'm pretty sure he would back me, I wrote like the first 2 lines of his thing because he started wanting to do more stuff. And that was just like a thing like me and my buddies, like from high school, you always used to say, oh, you're all that in a slice of cheese. You're all that in a bag of chips. So, and one line was stole from Dan Barry when Dan Barry was not Team Tremendous and he was just heel Dan Barry on some indies we were doing out in Connecticut. He announced him, can you call me your favorite wrestler's favorite wrestler? So that was stolen from Dan Barry. But the cream in your coffee, and God, I can't remember them all now. Cream in your coffee, your favorite wrestler's favorite wrestler. Those 2, like we just started putting stuff together. And so I can take credit at least for the first line. I agree when other wrestlers try and do it too much, it's too much. A couple of nicknames are okay because sometimes they bleed. The Raw Dog, the Meat Man, John Silver, kind of all goes together. But yeah, when people try and make it a little too crazy, a little too over the top and too many, it's like, yeah, no, we just do that for David Starr. So I will give a peek behind the curtain. When David Starr wrestled Orange Cassidy, that was in Worcester, right, at Electric Haze.
Oh, yeah.
Pretty sure we were at Chikara the night before or the afternoon before.
We did the tournament for tomorrow, tag team tournament at the Chikara building. It was a Beyond Wrestling event. And then this was night 2, so it was non-tournament action, Orange Cassidy versus David Starr.
So we were in Philly then on Saturday night. And I remember torrential downpours on the ride home. And I was traveling with Kevin Quinn and Paul Crockett. And the rain was so bad, and I think I was driving, and I was like, I don't want to drive in this shit. And we ended up staying somewhere in Jersey, which was near a Wawa, which is nice because we don't have those up here. But that next morning, I started writing up my cards for the show in Worcester, and we still had to drive from Jersey to Worcester. And I started writing up the cards, and I hit up Orange Cassidy. And I said, your wrestling star, I think it would be kind of funny if we somehow did a long, elaborate introduction for you. And that's where the Dunkin' Donuts napkin kind of came in. And so he kind of put that all together and thought it'd be funnier if instead of handing it to me on a card, it was written on the back of a napkin. which it was. So I do bring a little bit of something other than ring announcing, and that is one of my favorite things to watch. I actually lost my composure laughing so hard at that because I hadn't read it until I read it in the ring. But yeah, so too many nicknames. Leave it for David Starr. He is independent. And yeah, someday I'm going to memorize. I'm going to be 51 pretty soon. If we can pull off Uncharted Territory on April 30th, that'd be great because my birthday's on May 1st. So, and I work from home for my real job, so I can get as drunk as I want that night. So, I'll Uber. But yeah, I don't know. I'm rambling at this point.
No, it's all right. I'm kind of eyeballing, hoping that maybe we can be back in time for American Rana on July 26th. I don't know what's going to go on, but I do know that I appreciate your time. And once again, anybody that watched tonight's Positive Contact, again, brought to you by Independent Wrestling TV. So sign up for iwtv.live using promo code BEYOND. And I think the first American Rana is a great place to get started. And maybe if you don't have time to watch every single show from 2013 until now, if you jump in at American Rana every single year, it's usually a good way to see the contrast from year over year over year, especially the first three were at FET. We came back for the fourth at FET, moving on to the White Eagle for 2017 and 2018, and then 2019 at Foxwoods. And I'll tell you what, this shit better get taken care of in time for American Rana 2020 because I've got the contract signed. We've got the deposit on the venue. I can't go into more detail. It's one of those things where it's kind of like, hopefully this will be the light at the end of the tunnel. But obviously, Rich, to have you on for 2020 and another 20 years at least after that. So thank you again so much for your time. And I don't have a sign off yet. You have to. What's your sign off when the show's over? How would you sign this off if this is a Beyond Wrestling live event?
Well, thank you for supporting Beyond Wrestling and IWTV on behalf of myself and everybody here at Independent Wrestling Television. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for support, and please drive home safely.
Perfect. We're going to end it like that. Thanks for talking to me, Rich. Have a good one, all right?
Thanks, man.